yeah, welcome back, and thanks for sticking with us through this, especially into this panel, because this idea of therapeutic education, I think, really underlines, or maybe even precedes kind of intellectually, a lot of the phenomena that we've been discussing and that we would like to critique and get to grips with in education. I'll leave it to Dennis, who I'll introduce in a second, to give us kind of the definitive line on what it is we really mean by therapeutic education. But I think familiar to everyone will be things in education that focus on kind of the vulnerability of children, that want to talk about how important it is that we raise children's self-esteem, that we make sure that children feel good while they're being educated. But it also, therapeutic education has a political dimension to it as well. I think this kind of search for validation and validating children's identities immediately comes out in the way that identity politics is applied to education. We only need to think of the kind of therapeutic and medical implications of transgender ideology to understand that getting to grips with therapeutic education, I think, is a really key task for us. And I'm really delighted that we've got a great panel to kind of help us work through these issues. And then, as with the previous sessions, things will certainly come alive in the question and discussion afterwards. So let me introduce the panel in the order that they're going to speak. So as I mentioned, Dennis Hayes, who's sitting here on my left, he's a professor of education at the University of Derby. He's also the director of Academics for Academic Freedom. But in our context, the most important thing is that he's the author of The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic, the co-author of The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education, which, as I say, kind of lays out in a rigorous and systematic fashion kind of what this is, what this problem is, and why we should really care about it. So Dennis will take us through that in just a second. Speaking next will be Dr. Ashley Frawley, who's a senior research fellow for us at MCC Brussels. She's the author, and a writer, author most recently, I think, of Significant Emotions, but also widely writes in kind of popular press and commentates in her podcast and online in a variety of forums on kind of all things politics. So really delighted Ashley's with us. Then on my immediate right, we've got Paige McPherson, who's the Associate Director of Education for the Fraser Institute in Canada. Was great to have her through the whole couple of days, and we were discussing yesterday really interesting questions related to kind of teasing out something we were mentioning earlier, i.e. the state's role in education and how we can get to grips with that. So maybe more of that later on. And then last but by no means least, we're joined by Alex Standish, who's an Associate Professor of Geography Education at UCL, the co-author of the book we heard about with Alka earlier, and involved in a variety of ways, not just in education, but also something we've been talking about in terms of teacher training and the kind of generation of teachers. So can we give the panel a warm welcome, and then I'll hand over to Dennis.
Last week in the UK, it was Children's Mental Health Week, which spawned endless articles about the state of children's mental health. Harry Kane, our much-loved footballer, wasn't engaged in football, but he was talking to young people and encouraged them to speak up about their mental health. A report came out saying that 75% of parents of children between 0 and 5, well, obviously not 0, 1 and 5, were worried about their children's mental health. And it goes on and on, the concern with mental health. The Labour Party are going to put a counsellor in every school. So every secondary school will have a counsellor. And all the campaigning groups say that's not enough. We need them in every educational setting. And there's a campaign to have a mental health commissioner or czar in the UK. So the obsession with mental health is a key to some things that's happened. But I was going to say three things in relation to therapeutic education. And the first task is to recognise that you have to recognise, if you want to confront it, that there actually is a therapeutic culture and a victim culture. It's 15 years since Catherine Eccleston and I wrote The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. It's 20 years since Frank's book on therapy culture came out. It's 26 years since the therapeutic state came out in America. But it's 58 years since The Triumph of the Therapeutic came out in 1966. And there are more books I've already mentioned. Ashley's book, there's another book that's coming out on the anxious generation. So there's constant rediscovery of something that's happened in education. But I would say that the therapeutic culture is really dangerous. That's why the book is called The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. But most people don't think that. And one of the reasons is, for the last 20 years, people have been concerned, it's an ever-growing list, with self-esteem, with resilience, with emotional literacy, with happiness. Remember the great science of happiness we're all going to have as a new subject? Well-being, mindfulness, and all these concerns have consolidated into a concern with mental health. And the therapeutic turn, as I see its origins, came out of the collapse of politics in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and looking for something else to focus on in politics. And I don't think it was conscious. It arose spontaneously. I mentioned the Democratic National Convention in America. You remember Clinton's phrase, "I feel your pain"? It's a very famous phrase used. Don't do anything about it, but I feel it. And it was like, people described it as like a therapy group, people sitting round in circles, not like here, you're in traditional rows, which is the right thing, and we're not just nasal caving. So, and I think after that, it started there, but I say to Paige, it didn't stop there. It was taken up all over, but slowly, and then it got taken up deliberately by government. And I think I see it as very much an elite project. To the two people who are most concerned about mental health, apart from professional organisations in the UK, do you know who they are? Wills and Kate. So you've got the royal family are concerned about your mental health. And it really is a new way of looking at people. So instead of saying the traditional thing, which is say, working class people are thick, right? Now you would say, they need emotional literacy, they need help with their mental health. So it's very much a diminished view of people. And sometimes it comes out. We had a debate at the Battle of Ideas a few years ago, and the title was Mindfulness, Empty Minds for an Empty Society. It was a very good debate, and people took apart all the funding that was going on to mindfulness. In fact, it has no effect, no good effect at all, probably negative effects. So one person, I think, had got £6 million for mindfulness initiatives in schools, which shows you there's a cash nexus here. Jamie Bristow from the Mindfulness Institute was under pressure, and he suddenly stopped and looked at the audience and said, "We are not well. Right? We are not well." So that's the idea that you're now a diminished human being. When Anthony said, your idea of education is determined by your concept of a human being, I think we're being sold a very diminished concept of a human being, one that can't rise to its human potential and can't receive the knowledge that can be passed on, but one who will always be vulnerable, potentially vulnerable. And before the book came out, we had lots of articles written about it saying that authors say we're producing can't cope children, but now you can extend it, can't cope children, can't cope adults. It goes through all the generations. And one of the reasons it's difficult to get people to see it's dangerous, and I will say why it's dangerous, is because it seems so kindly. Philip Reif, when he was writing about it, when the collapse of ascetic morality, he said, "Why has nobody challenged this?" And he used the phrase, "What apocalypse has ever been so kindly?" Because it seems something that's kind. So what is it? Well, it's a myriad of policies and practices that basically emphasize the emotional over the intellectual. And it's not a balancing of the intellectual with passions or anything. It's entirely replacing them. So in sessions, it's all about your feelings. And I think I've characterized it in a way that's a big shift from class war between the elites and ordinary people to couch war. Everybody's trying to get people on the therapy couch. And I think at the heart of it, there's what I call a dual attack on the subject. So the human subject is being seen as something that's diminished, an emotional subject rather than a knowing subject. But it follows from that there's an attack on school subjects, the subjects that embody knowledge for schools. And so it's an attack on knowledge itself. It's no longer about what you know, it's all about what you feel. And as we were saying to Paige, it's not, you can't feel anything. Some of my great emotions that have got me on in life are anger, jealousy, passion. They're not the emotions you're supposed to have. You're supposed to have empathy, consideration, kindness, and so on. So the real task is to recognize the dangerousness. So first, recognize there's a therapy culture. Recognize that it's fundamentally dangerous, and we can go through lots of examples of how it is. But the third task is to stop teachers being therapists. And in a follow-up book to The Triumph of the Therapeutic, it's a rambling account, it's called To My Fellow Teachers, Philip Rice made it very clear, a teacher cannot be a therapist. It's not that they won't do a bad job, a lot of them play about with people's emotions in a way that's incredibly scary. But teachers cannot do it. And I would say if you put it to a vote, they would say they're either concerned with social justice or therapy, or they both merge. The teachers have started to see themselves as therapists, and I think it's a fundamental difference. So you have to start, I think, at grassroots. My gut instinct is to trust teachers, but I can't trust them if they think they're therapists. And that's the challenge we have. And I think, the examples that Ruth gave of some of the Catholic schools, and it's interesting how often Catholic schools have come up over these 2 days we've had for trying to maintain some sort of values and standards. But we've got to work out how we relate to teachers. There are 5.5 million teachers in the European Union, 600,000 in Britain, and they were described in the 1990s as the Blob. The Blob was a 1950s horror movie with this big jelly thing that just swallowed everything up. And that's how they function. They won't debate, they won't discuss, because they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing the best for the children, the poor, vulnerable children. So I think that's the core of this. The dangerousness of it is it's producing a new concept idea of a human being as somebody who is essentially vulnerable and who can never escape from it. When we were writing the introduction to the second edition of the book, the Thai boys were trapped in the cave, do you remember? And all the articles said, that's it, they'll never recover from being trapped in that cave. They came out and they started playing football, they were fine. There's not the, and even it's not that traumatic experience. Any experience now is something you can never escape from. So it's an incredibly dangerous thing for us to be doing. And it is a way of relating people, though. It's very successful. We were saying this before. If I present myself as vulnerable, I've been really hurt in my life, what are you going to say? If I started crying now about my past, what would you do? Boo me off the stage, but you're a different audience. But it gives you authority. Your victimhood is not weak. It gives you strong moral authority. Right? You cannot be challenged. Matthew Parrish wrote a very good article about this, about Diana. If you present yourself as a victim, you can't be challenged. But neither can the people who are supporting the victim. So if I'm the teacher supporting the victims in the classroom, I can't be touched. And who would ever want to be so unkindly as to challenge that?
Ashley, thanks.
Right, everyone, let me tell you about my victimhood. No. Okay, therapeutic education is a strange beast. Because the more you look into it, look into what it says versus what it actually does, the more you're confronted with a series of paradoxes. So I'm going to try to draw out what it is and what it does by looking at one of the flagship therapeutic fads in education at present, and that is the idea of a whole school or whole university or whole institution approach to mental health. And I want to say that it's less about making people feel good than, echoing Dennis, creating and encouraging a particular outlook on the self, an ideal of citizenship and a way of being. It claims to be drawn about the true knowledge of human beings, but actually it creates this kind of subject. It claims to be based on a science that has revealed that human beings are actually weak and quite likely to be led astray. but it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And actually, I think there are some reasons to be hopeful, because even as a self-fulfilling prophecy, even with the most powerful invitation in our culture, you have the moral authority of victimhood, you have the invitation to constantly emote, not everybody accepts that invitation. So even in terms of what it does implicitly, it's not that successful. So what is a whole school or whole university approach? Well, this is the idea that's become quite powerful in the sort of English-speaking world, and it's now becoming very powerful in Europe with the idea of a European education area. And one of the key ideas in this is that schools should promote mental health and well-being in everything that they do. It should be embedded in the curriculum. That there should be joined-up services so you can immediately identify when someone is in need and send them off to a service. But that's less important than the broader idea of promotion of mental health and prevention of future problems. And in this idea of a whole school approach to mental health and well-being, knowledge isn't just implicitly sidelined. So in some of the earlier discussions today, we heard people talking about, like, well, if you listen to educationalists, you could be forgiven for thinking that, knowledge is on the sidelines. No, that is what they want you to think. It is very explicit. They say knowledge is too narrow an indicator of educational performance. Knowledge is passé. And indeed, knowledge gets reframed as a threat to one's mental health and well-being. And if you go through some of the documents that are produced for the European Union by these sort of therapeutic entrepreneurs, by these experts who claim to have this special knowledge and are administering and teaching us how we should run our education systems, if you read what they write, they explicitly say that knowledge isn't really something we should be focusing on, that the whole purpose of education should be to promote mental health. And it's quite explicit. It's not implicit. And they, they'll say things like, the pressure to succeed is bad for your mental health. So even having this knowledge focus is potentially injurious to the vulnerabilities of children. So why a whole university, whole school approach? Well, it means no one is left out. And what's very interesting about this is I just did a study with Catherine Eccleston, who's actually one of the co-authors of The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. We've just produced our first publication from it. And one of the things that we noticed that was very interesting is that in spite of all this talk of mental health promotion and so on, when we actually interviewed people in what were formerly called counseling services, they wanted nothing to do with mental illness. And the people who were the most vociferous advocates of embedding mental health in the curriculum were very clear. They don't deal with that mental illness thing, right? And so the students come in and they're thinking, oh, this institution, they've sold it to me as like a mental health thing. And if they, God forbid, actually have a problem, let's say they have like a psychotic break or something, they will quickly find it's very difficult to actually get help if you have a mental illness. And what happens is they keep getting steered to different people. And they get pushed to the NHS, for instance, and the NHS goes, no, we don't want you. You're supposed to go to your institution. And they can't actually get any help. So then, what's the point of all of this? Because as I said, the more you look into what it says and what it does, you see these paradoxes. Well, it's a whole institution because no one gets left out of the purview of what is actually a very insidious form of discipline and control of risk. What it's actually about is managing populations. So what therapeutic entrepreneurs have done, and why this has become so powerful, is they have played upon institutions and governments' fears about the riskiness of populations. And they're absolutely convinced that the reason why we have social problems is because you simply will not think what you should, behave the way you should, make the right choices. You have emotional problems excuse me, that lead you astray. And they've got the solution. They can teach you how to manage your emotions and therefore manage your behaviors. So what it's really about is a form of control that goes all the way inside. And I'll give you an example from this outside of education. My sister one day sent me a picture of a bunch of, she's at her desk at work, and there's a bunch of stickers on her fingers. And they have emojis on them. And they say, sad, frustrated, happy. And she's invited, the management all went around handing out all these stickers. And she was invited to wear them throughout the day as her emotions changed and walk around the workplace. And the managers were all very excited about this. We're breaking down the stiff upper lip. We're breaking down the stigmas. And all the workers are like, this is weird. But what was it doing? Before, you could go into the workplace and think, I hate my job. This sucks. But you get through it, right? I'm going to get my paycheck. You stoke yourself up. You do what you got to do to get through the glass of wine. But now, if you have those feelings, you must emote. You must display them. Why? So management can see, oh, you're frustrated, are you? Let's have a talk about why that might be. Now, this I say it's an insidious form of discipline because at least you go back to how prisons used to operate. Prisons, the threat, you still have this, of course, but the ever-present threat of violence, you would beat somebody into submission. But that's dangerous because someone's body can submit, but their mind is still their own. In this form of discipline, you don't, you feel it all the way. You control yourself. You control yourself. That's how discipline works. That's how discipline works in schools. So one of the other aspects of therapeutic education is co-production. You invite the students to co-produce their mental health interventions as part of the curriculum. And this, having done teacher training myself, I think, well, that's just how you get students to control themselves these days. You don't say, listen, everyone, these are my rules, this is my classroom. You start out the term and you say, what kind of rules would make this an effective classroom? Yes, Johnny, okay. And we make the rules ourselves. And then when Johnny breaks a rule, you don't say, Johnny, I am punishing you. You say, Johnny, what rule did you just break? That one? I'm sorry, everyone, we can't go out for recess because Johnny broke the rule. And everyone goes, oh, Johnny. And Johnny feels that he's not being punished by an authority figure. He punishes himself. And so what this agenda supposedly does is it kind of teaches you the correct ways to feel. It teaches you to identify when your emotions have gone astray because you are feeling frustrated, sad, whatever these negative emotions might be. Emote them. Seek out some authority figure who's not really an authority figure. It's just someone who has this knowledge or whatever. Or even now they'll give you an app. There's not even really a human there. And to bring those emotions onto an acceptable script. Now you've transformed a risk into an asset. You've transformed somebody whose behaviors might be risky into a person who now knows the correct ways to think and feel and is able then to administer to others. Again, that's part of the whole university or whole institution approach. Not only do you teach children to recognize their negative feelings, you teach them also to administer to others. So you have mental health first aiders, that sort of thing. And so this person who might maybe drink too much, let's say universities, right? The student population, they're you want their money, but they're young, they drink, they have sex, this sort of thing. That's risky. Now you teach them how to control their emotions, how to label them, how to seek out help for things, and now they're an asset. They can turn around and minister to others. They can be the mental health first aider in their dorm. It's a way of controlling risk. And at a population level, it's a way of creating an ideal citizen who recognizes that the exercise of their own autonomy and choice is a risk to themselves and others. It's a creation of a heteronymous subject, not an autonomous subject. A subject that recognizes, that learns to second-guess themselves, recognizes that their own choices are risks, that they're likely to choose wrong, and seek out always this specialized knowledge to bring their behaviors onto a specialized script. And I want to close by saying, if there's any bit of optimism, it's what I said at the beginning. that actually it doesn't always work. Most people, in spite of this powerful invitation, still see themselves as autonomous. They still trust that they have judgments and they can make choices, and they want to be citizens of a democratic society, not allowing their betters to make choices for them. They do not always second-guess themselves. They don't necessarily see themselves as vulnerable subjects. A lot of people do accept that invitation, but not everyone. And that's partially why those in power keep pushing harder. Keep pushing. So the push now in the European Union is, oh, you have the principle of subsidiarity says that you have control over education systems. We don't like that. Let's push harder. Why? Because you will not accept that ideal subjectivity that therapeutic education valorizes, that you are a vulnerable subject, that you cannot be trusted to choose. But people still trust themselves.
Thanks, Ashley. Yep. And please, Paige.
Okay, thank you first of all to the MCC for having me here, all the way from Canada, my first time in Brussels, and I very much appreciate it. It's been a breath of fresh air talking to all of you. So I work for an organization called the Fraser Institute. It's a national think tank in Canada, and we are the largest think tank in Canada, and our motto is, if it matters, measure it. But it's become very hard to measure student achievement in Canada when we have moved away from testing, moved away from testing specific things like content knowledge, and moved away from that testing mattering to students. And this really is a central part of the work that we do at the Fraser Institute. And student well-being, as I'll refer to it, is really often given as the justification from this shift away from testing. Student well-being in Canada has justified declining standards, declining academic rigor. It has justified giving students fewer tests and those tests mattering less. It has justified less communication with parents, less engagement in important ways in our education system, and also justified less control for teachers in the classroom. So I just want to maybe share my experience of what has happened in Canada, our collective experience, I guess, with education, and just be clear about, I guess, how the influence of this movement has impacted that. And I'm referring mostly here to government schools, which are where most Canadian students are educated. We do have some school choice in some provinces, but anywhere between about 87% to about 98% of students are educated in government schools in Canada, depending on the province. Now, I'll be clear when I say that Canada performs relatively well on international student assessments, but our performance is declining. So over the past 20 years, per PISA tests, students are about 2 years behind where they were 20 years ago in math, and about 1.5 years behind where they were in reading 20 years ago. About 1 in 8 kids in Canada under the age of 15 cannot read at grade level. Now, we know that PISA is a skills test, as we've talked, sort of a technical assessment, but we do rely on it heavily now in Canada because our own standardized tests in Canada, per our own research, are declining in terms of the number of tests, how much these tests assess content knowledge, and how much these tests actually matter for students, how much they impact their final grades or their ability to graduate. Now, the organized push against testing is really organized mostly in Canada by teachers' unions and activists that play a large role in our education system as stakeholders, but it's all under the guise of protecting student mental health. The British Columbia, that's where we are based in the Fraser Institute, the teachers' union there said that testing is hurtful to students, and that's why it should be abolished, not just rolled back, but just completely eliminated. So like in other places, as we've talked about today, Canada has moved away from those foundational facts, that foundational knowledge, bless you, and toward some more student-centered inquiry learning, which has completely changed in our country the authoritative role of the teacher in the classroom. And now behavioral issues are prevalent in Canadian classrooms. In some provinces, over 90% of teachers have actually experienced violence in their own schools or classrooms. And we're Canadian. We're very nice and polite people, and this is happening in Canadian classrooms. But because of these falling standards and then the resulting political pressure on provincial governments, some of those provincial governments have started reintroducing some foundational knowledge, some academic rigor back into the curriculum, despite the impact that it might have on student well-being. But even in one recent example, in Ontario, which is where I'm originally from, and where the largest share of students are educated in Canada, in a so-called back to basics, which is really it's our politicized term for the return to foundational knowledge in our curriculum. In one of these reforms, it's still included, and this was a positive reform, it still included a heavy focus on social emotional learning and coping with math anxiety embedded in the math curriculum. And this new math curriculum that was said to be a positive step in the right direction actually highlighted how, and I quote, "mathematics has been used to normalize racism and marginalization of non-Eurocentric mathematical knowledges." It's a mouthful. So fortunately, this portion of the curriculum regarding racism actually was recognized and publicized, and it was ridiculed by many parents, and it was overturned because parents evidently want their kids to learn the times tables rather than 3 times 7 equals colonialist oppression. But the focus on math anxiety for children remains as a central part of the curriculum. The same province actually eliminated streaming in math in grade 9, which we used to separate students into 2 cohorts based on aptitude. And the reason they did this was to make sure every child, irrespective of their background, ethnicity, or faith, has an equal shot at succeeding, which again is all about student mental health. The topic of parental rights in Canada has also become a political issue, and I think that has probably similar to what is being experienced in much of Europe and the US, and Jonathan talked about that earlier. And we know from our research that political engagement in certain ways in education can actually improve student achievement. And yet these policies in Canada that are meant to protect students are making it harder and harder for parents to be informed and engaged. So the politicized topic in this area is really the gender and sex topics in the curriculum, parents needing to offer consent in order to have their children learn those topics. That's a topic in one province right now. But in another way, schools have moved away from report cards with clear letter grades or clear percentage grades to vague statements that are just much harder for parents to understand. So in British Columbia, which is one of our larger provinces in Canada, to prevent the lower performing students from always being discouraged. That's the reason that was given by the British Columbia Department of Education by moving away from letter grades on report cards. Now, our research shows that the vast majority of Canadian parents support standardized testing to understand how their children are doing. They want to have a clear understanding through report cards and through standardized tests at the province level, yet governments are rolling these tests back, in the name of student mental health. So finally, I'll just share one other example of how this is impacting Canadian education. And this actually goes back to 2014 when it made news that a Canadian school board and a government school board fired a teacher in Alberta, another Canadian province, for the teacher refusing the school's no-zero policy. When his students were not showing up to class to take a test or they failed to hand in an assignment, he insisted on giving them a 0 grade. But the school policy in protecting student well-being and mental health said that he could not do that. And as a result, because he refused, the government school at which he taught actually fired him. The school board fired him. And of course, a private school was quick to scoop him up. And again, these no-fail policies, they live on today in Canadian government school classrooms. Many school boards in Canada have made it extremely difficult to actually fail a grade, that is, not to advance to the next grade and need to repeat the year. That is something that was relatively commonplace when I went to school in my childhood that is virtually unheard of now. They need to exhaust all other possible alternatives, and only in exceptional circumstances can a child be failed or held back a year. So just to sum up, we have lost our academic rigor in many cases. We've moved away from content knowledge being important. We've moved away from meaningful assessments, and by that I mean assessments that kids actually care about. They don't just have to write a smiley face because participation is the only thing that matters, which is what the new assessments in British Columbia look like. I mean assessments that actually matter for them to pursue or to continue on in their educational career. And we've also disengaged parents. And the irony is that our own research shows that youth mental health, especially coming out of the COVID school closures in Canada and the lockdowns associated with that, it's not in a healthy state. And research from elsewhere shows that youth mental health today has actually worsened over the past 2 decades. So even if this is what you believe that school should be about, which I don't, but even if you do, if it's about making kids feel good, I think that those activists need to ask themselves, is this actually working? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paige. And Alex.
Okay, thank you, Jacob, and pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk I'd like to talk about the relationship between the individual or the self and the social education. So I'm going to use an example which Jacob already brought up actually earlier of Greta Thunberg, although more than Greta Thunberg. So an example where I think I'd say an example of therapeutic education. And I'm going to contrast that with a second example of somebody who I think got a better education. She was taught and certainly moved beyond her own positions. So if we start with, go back to sort of 2018, 2019, which is when Greta Thunberg came on the scene in relation to these Fridays for the Future demonstrations, school strikes, young people going out on the street, clearly visibly concerned and worried about climate change. And that's, at one level, that's a good thing. It's you might say it's a starting point for engaging a discussion with them. But the reaction from schools, from adults, as we saw sort of very visibly with Greta Thunberg, was really to indulge them and to say, this is terrible, and yes, you should skip school, you should go out in the street, you should exercise your concerns, and we need to listen to you. And as Greta Thunberg said, she says, I don't want you to be hopeful, I want you to be fearful, our home is on fire. She was sort of giving back a lot of the things that a lot of the headlines, a lot of the messages around environmentalism and climate change that have been in the news from United Nations. There was the Guardian headline, we have 12 years left to save the planet from climate catastrophe. So not surprisingly, young people were internalizing this and expressing their concerns, and some students saying, why bother to go to school if the planet is going to burn? So their reaction was not unsurprising, but the response of adults was in that they simply indulged them. And yes, there's plenty of education about climate change going on, but what they could have done is they could have used it as an opportunity to take them beyond their position. So there's the American Neil Postman, American educator, who says that schools are the only institution that is capable of offering young people, I guess schools and universities, the only institution capable of offering them what is not happening in a culture. Okay, we are dominated by environmentalism, catastrophizing. Schools have the opportunity to take them beyond that. They could have helped them to put climate change into perspective by showing them, historic climate change, and that the planet has been different in the past, that natural climate change is going on at the same time as anthropogenic climate change. They could have taught them about how people lived through the last ice age. Okay, we've adapted to much climate change in the past, and we will adapt to climate change in the future. They could have taught young people. We could have taught young people that it's not that the adults are irresponsible, that they've built a world on fossil fuels, and this is leading to disaster. But they could have taught them about the positives of fossil fuels and how we built a very safe, successful society through fossil fuels. And there's a debate about, obviously we might need to move away from that, but there was a failure to educate them about how far society has come and the positives of development. And yes, that we can change, we will adapt. We could have shown young people, what will happen as the climate warms and how we can adapt and how we will live with climate change. We could have reassured young people and shown them a way forward. Okay, but that wasn't what happened. So my contrasting example then is from a new book by a young woman called Hannah Ritchie, which is titled Not to the End of the World. Her story is interesting, as I say, because it contrasts. And I mean, she admits that her education, I guess, also failed her school and university education. And she says that when she was in school, she thought we're all going to die from climate change. She was one of those people, although she's in her 30s now. And she also spent 4 years at the University of Edinburgh studying environmental geoscience. But she says at the end of that, she was very depressed. She was very depressed, very despondent. Her environmental concerns are her thing, but she nearly walked away from it because she felt, nothing could be done. She said in that 4-year degree, she didn't have one positive story about environmental change, not one positive story. She could have learnt about, the ozone layer and how that's been reversed. She could have learnt about acid rain and how that's been improved, but the university didn't. There was no balance. There was no attempt to correct her worldview. Anyway, by chance, she came across. You might have heard of Hans Rosling, the professor of global health, now passed away, and his Gapminder institution. So she came across his work, I think, on the television initially, and he has his bubble charts to show countries and showing change over time, so sort of 200 years of progress. So she came across this, and initially she kind of, she almost didn't engage. She said she sort of dismissed it. This is just not true. The world is not getting better; things are getting worse. But she paused, she listened, she engaged, and she learnt, and slowly she realised that her view of the world was wrong. And that her education had let her down. And so she's gone on to be a data scientist, and she helps to run the organization Our World in Data, which produces wonderful educational resources for schools. And a bit like Gapminder, she shows data that reveals change over time. And her book is about 7 environmental problems: air pollution, climate change, deforestation, fishing, plastic pollution, and agriculture. And, when you look at the data, you realize that actually these things aren't as bad as they're made out to be in the news, and we can't just rely on that worldview. So her example is I guess, for me, is in contrast to therapeutic education. And I want to draw on Gert Biester's notion of subjectivity here. So Gert Biester says there are 3 domains to education: qualifications, socialization, and subjectification. And by subjectification, he means the orientation of the self, or the formation of the self, as a social process. And here I'm saying I want to contrast this to the sort of therapeutic notions that you've heard. And his phrase is, through education, the world comes into us and we come into the world. The world comes into us and we come into the world. You learn a subject or subjects, and slowly you start to internalize them. You start to identify with them. You start to acquire that knowledge. They help you to think in a certain way. That gradually becomes part of who you are. So this process of education is one of interruption. It turns the student the question of whether what they desire is what they should be desiring. And for this to become a living question in the life of the child. So what they desire are their everyday desires, what they should be desiring. It introduces them to bigger questions, more sophisticated ways of seeing the world, and so slowly they move away from perhaps their more personal concerns and start to think about bigger questions and engage with the world. So, Hannah Ritchie, coming back to Hannah Ritchie, she didn't, I think her education let her down, but she was fortunate to come across Hans Rosling. He was her teacher, even though I don't think she ever met him. Now she understands, or she thinks, that development is the best way to address environmental problems, because more developed countries are those that tend to take better care of the environment, and that her first first suggestion for adaptation to climate change is to lift people out of poverty. Okay, so her understanding of the world has changed, has been transformed through her education, which some of it is definitely down to herself. So this idea that we transform through education, as a social process, is in parallel to what Levinas calls uniqueness, that our responsibility, we take responsibility, and that becomes an essential part of our subjectivity, that someone calls for you and only you. It becomes, that sort of calling. So your subjectivity often comes from outside. Your engagement with something outside, that, you wouldn't have thought of this, you wouldn't have become part of this, but a teacher has led you there, has made you think differently, and changed your relationship to the world. And then you decide whether you take that up. Okay, so in some, education then has the potential to transcend us, transcend our origins, and remake the self. And I think we can contrast that with therapeutic education, which, as Hannah Arendt said, well, she didn't say about therapeutic education, but a real destruction of living space occurs whenever we try to turn children into a real world. And we can see that with, the Greta Thunbergs and other children who are, if we don't educate them, but we try to indulge them and promote them and their worldview and turn that into a real world, then we're destroying not only their education, I'd say we're probably destroying their childhood as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alex. So there's plenty I could pick up on there, but in kind of as a little piece of therapy for maybe the after lunch blues, I'm going to come straight out to the audience, try and stir things up a little bit that way. So I'll pass over the microphone, but raise your hand if you want to speak.
Thank you. The mention of the Canadian tests and how they affect the mental health of students was a pretty bit chilling experience, because last week the disastrous PISA test in Germany also took the reaction by the teachers union, and obviously it was just abolish the test itself. But so it's I think this is a phenomenon that we can. When it's in Canada and it's in Germany, I guess in the other countries you can see the same reactions. And but the German teachers union say that it's affecting the mental health of the teachers. So because this is so distrustful against the teachers that we are measuring their performance, that this is basically putting them into the danger of all kinds of mental diseases. So this is, I think, this kind of testing we should be really careful of, that we have in the future as well.
Yeah, nice, thanks, Richard. Further questions and comments? I'll throw a few myself. Okay, we'll take Marion, front, then John.
Thank you. This was really great. I just have a quick question and just a comment, because in my years of teaching, I had like 2 students actually having some sort of mental fit in my class. Might be my fault because I teach media and gender, so it might be my fault. But what they then claimed was a disability compensation. So their mental health then fell under the Disability Act. So they were declaring themselves disabled. So that with this comes a lot of compensation, actual legal status, and so on and so on. So it goes, in my opinion, further than just a therapy culture, but there's a kind of legal and social apparatus now behind this that is based on, a real problem. Disability is something we actually want to do something about. Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of very, very quick points. Firstly, about the mixed messages that children get when teachers do recognise that there is a problem here and try and push back against it. A very quick anecdote. My daughter's 17. She's in her final year at school. She's got her final A-level exams coming up in a few weeks' time. To her horror, her absolute horror, a teacher said that during half term this week, which is a week off school, they should be revising for 8 hours a day. My daughter was apoplectic about this. She couldn't believe a teacher would tell her such a thing. The following week was, as Dennis pointed out, Mental Health Awareness Week. They were taken out of history class to go and do laughter yoga in the school hall, where you kind of mix, from what I can gather, meditating with forced laughter. To her credit, she walked out after 10 minutes, but not, unfortunately, to go back to the history class. The second quick point I wanted to make was, like I said, I think there is some growing recognition that this is a problem, not just from within schools, but from outside of schools as well. I mean, perhaps from an older generation, perhaps from a more conservative generation, who are looking on in horror at some of the kind of broader therapeutic culture. The problem is the way that this is being tackled is not often by a kind of classical approach to education, by the foregrounding of knowledge, but by importing other kind of opposite, if you like, mental health interventions, particularly around resilience. And, you know, I've lost count of a number of times I've been asked to kind of write reports promoting resilience education as the antidote to therapeutic education. And it's a hopeless endeavour because it constricts children into this world of feelings and maintains the obsession with mental health and mental well-being, but it just tries to come at it from an opposite perspective. It's worse than useless.
Great, thanks. Let's take one more from Anthony, and then we'll get some responses from
I've got one small point and a slightly different point. I always contrast Greta Thunberg, who refused to go to school, with Malala Yousafzai, who got shot for going to school. And I think we probably don't think enough about children who, for whatever reason, want to be educated and can't be. And I think that our concerns should be much more focused at them. But it seems to me that this whole business of therapy, obviously it's not just with children. I mean, we've moved away from any sense that we should be in control of our emotions, not controlled by them. And I dare say this is because we have forgotten what Aristotle said about any moral society, decent society, depends on children being, in his word, trained, and I mean trained, in habits of virtue. So if you've got habits of virtue, then you can confront difficulties that come to you. And of course, one of the virtues that Aristotle thought should be inculcated, though Martha Nussbaum would absolutely blow a gasket if I said this, well, she has, I mean, she's written a book saying it, was shame. And I think that children should be taught to feel shame and guilt, but more shame, actually, about what is dishonourable. And it's painful, but then that is how you become a fully functioning human being.
Great, thanks a lot. I'll just take you in the kind of order of the panel. Ashley, have you got a couple of quick thoughts?
Yeah, so on the idea of resilience, I find, and there's always endless, like the way I talk about it in my book is these endless waves of therapeutic fads. You critique one, the next one comes up. And in fact, the people who have taken the new therapeutic entrepreneurs, often the same as the old ones, but they're hawking something new, but they often present themselves as critics of the old, right? So they're like, oh, the happiness education is so silly. What we really need is mental health education. What we really need is mindfulness. I'm interested in the concept of bliss. You know, they've always got something. And what it's doing is, what it really says to people is, the only thing that you can actually change here is this. The problems of society are between people's ears. And they can't think outside that. There's always some new thing, and even like character education becomes this as well. It becomes like, Aristotle says that a healthy body is just as important as a healthy mind. I'm not kidding, that was actually in a curriculum thing. Like it becomes totally ridiculous in just a million ways of essentially getting at what's underneath all of this is a fundamental misanthropy, a fundamental belief. The reason why things go wrong is because we are essentially emotionally dysregulated. We're quite likely to be led astray, be led by and ruled by unruly emotions, and that all of these things have to come in and fix the individual. And in this way, it also abdicates responsibility, or allows policymakers to abdicate responsibility for not being able to solve some of the problems they task education and therapeutic education with solving. So if you go through the literature on whole university approaches, they do this like post hoc justification for why this is necessary. They're already sure education is necessarily damaging to you. They know this. It's, of course, anything difficult damages you. So then they go out and they try to do these studies of like, well, what's causing mental ill health among students? Of course, keep in mind they define mental ill health as any bad emotion, any negative emotion. And they say, in universities, for instance, it's fees and their financial concerns. And then that's so terrible. And what are their recommendations? More mental health support, right? Or it's like, what's causing the problem? They're worried about job prospects. Oh, that's a shame. More mental health support. They can't do anything about that. What they can do is they can give you more mental health support. And this leads to some hilarious ironies where they will bang on about how fees and financial difficulties are causing all this mental distress, which is why it's so important to maintain high fees to pay for the therapeutic education and all these counselors. It's ridiculous.
I'm more worried about it. I'm not very optimistic at all because when we were writing the new edition to the book, we put the continuing dangerous rise. And I kept thinking, shall I say here now, it's risen? And I just think...
The triumph?
Well, the trouble is, it's children who are adopting this. I get, some adults may be cynical about it, but children are starting to think about it. Everything is interpreted through their feelings. Students will say to you, the example I think Ruth gave me, a student coming out of a tutorial who said, oh my God, that tutorial with Ashley really affected my mental health. And it isn't cynical. I mean, some people do exploit it. I mean, students come with badges now, ADHD. Every time they go around, they've got dyslexia. But they're proud of the badges. I used to teach in special education, and people try to avoid being labelled. You didn't want to say you were dyslexic, or you didn't want to have that label. You wanted to overcome the problems, but nobody wants to do that anymore. So I'm more worried about it, and the signs of optimism, I just don't know. You're right about it. Self-esteem was the first one in the 2000s. Then it became resilience, because self-esteem seems a bit negative. Everybody said, oh, my self-esteem is really bad, so self-reliance. Let's make them self-reliant. It's like a hydra-headed monster you could get rid of. But it's difficult when you even teach the values. The head teacher of St. Martin's was on a panel talking about what you should teach in schools. And he gave the values they teach. One of them was fortitude. And immediately people on the panel started saying, oh, well, perhaps we should teach them not to have fortitude and not do these things. So these are the teachers. So I think it has been absorbed into the culture of teaching in a way. I'll just give one quick example. Well, I first came across this working in further education because it was competence-focused. Everybody taught the most horrible competencies, one of which, you'll love to know, was appreciation of the European Union. Right? This is and I was saying to Frank, we could never agree, so we did the book on, we did out this thing, are you a teacher or are you a trainer? So we had an argument about it. But I could go to these classes where people were being taught the most instrumental, competence-based education, and they were all doing it through Carl Rogers. So they were literally hugging one another at the end of the class and thanking one another for this wonderful experience. Joy, whoever mentioned Joy was in those classrooms, but it was subjection to the yoke. So I agree with Ashley about that. It is a way of controlling people. But I'm more scared about it. It's worse than the Soviet Union to me because they get inside people's minds. Just one last example, I must give it one. Vanessa Pupavak told me this story that she studies at Nottingham and studies the former Yugoslavia. And they had interventions from UNESCO, and they thought they were having a bad time because they were poor. So after about 3 weeks of intervention, they all discovered that they weren't poor. The real problem was that they were depressed. Right? So national agencies are promoting these things all around the world. That's why I don't think Central Europe's going to be safe from many of these things.
Yeah. Paige?
So I can address the testing connection with teachers' unions, and I will just offer, I guess, the traditional Canadian sorry for bringing a chilling experience to you. But the same thing happens. Teachers' unions are the loudest advocates against standardized testing in Canada, for sure. Standardized tests are not just a test of the student. They are a test of teachers. They're a test of schools. They're a test of education policymakers and the education system as a whole. So if you have a vested interest against having an accountability mechanism for your own ease or self-comfort or well-being, whatever it might be, I mean, that incentive, it does make sense. And so we see this as well. I think the rhetoric around standardized testing is certainly around student well-being and mental health, but the teachers' unions are the loudest advocates, so I think there's something to that. The other thing I'll just comment briefly on is the disabled, label and the accommodation on tests, and maybe just how this has played out, or just the broadening of students who maybe should be exempt from tests in British Columbia, the same province where there's currently a really strong push against standardized testing, and where standardized testing in high schools at the province level have actually been quite watered down to these sort of vague student assessments. And there is, again, facilitated by the teachers' union, an active push against tests, and what they've said to parents in an effort to eliminate these tests is, look, these are really stressful for your children. If your children are really stressed out by taking these tests, don't make them take the tests. Tell them not to take them. And what has actually happened is that, in fact, people haven't students are no longer, they're considered technically, per the policy in the province, mandatory for graduation, and yet the rates of participation on these high school assessments are significantly down, according to our research, and yet graduation rates are actually up. They've increased. So they're obviously not impacting graduation in the way that they're supposed to.
It's easier to graduate if you don't have to take the tests. So.
Right. Well, actually, the tests are so meaningless that you could write a smiley face on them, and it's just having completed it. You don't need a good grade. So basically what I'm saying is that there's this organized push against the tests, which can then serve as a political tool for those who want to abolish the tests, because they can then say, look, people aren't even taking these tests. They're not valuable anymore. Even the Fraser Institute is finding it difficult to measure student achievement because the participation rates are decreased, which is true. And so it's a snowball. It's not good.
Yeah, nice. Alex?
Thank you. I'd echo the comments about the student needs, special needs and things, which, I mean, there's a whole industry now, isn't there, at universities in which this happens. And I work in teacher training, so it's not just children, it's young adults who come and, as Dennis was saying, they're almost proud of these labels now. And obviously there are people with genuine, special needs, genuine problems, but it becomes very difficult to distinguish between, the more serious cases and those that are less serious. And then they, I guess you then, after they've been processed, you then receive emails, notes about how you have to change your teaching. How far ahead you have to give them their notes for the lecture, in what form that has to be. So it all gets kind of dictated to you. The timing of when they can hand in their assignments. Yeah, I mean, we lose control. Right? We lose control. But I guess I also wanted to make a point about sort of student teachers that, I've seen a change in the language they use to describe their experiences in schools, and learning to teach is quite a difficult thing. It is most definitely stressful, anxiety-inducing. And I'm sure those of us who've been teachers remember learning to teach. Yeah, was pretty difficult. So you now hear more talk about how it's damaging my mental health. I can't sleep at night. So the concern is not. It's less focused on what they're trying to do. The concern seems to sort of be turned inwards. On them, and that's so instead of saying, well, okay, maybe a bit of loss of sleep and stress is like normal, and I want to push through this because what comes out at the other end is worth it. Some actually take the choice that this is too damaging to my mental health, and I don't want to go any further. So
yeah, well, great. we'll come out for some more points
Not
and
really.
questions. Yeah, Tony, start with yourself, and then we can take them. Maybe Jamie can take this microphone over in the middle there.
Yeah, thanks very much. Two things that are related. First of all, you're talking about this as it sounds like it comes across as an imposition from on high, and certainly from my experience, Dennis, of teaching in further education, it's certainly not just coming from on high. It is sucked up and loved by the vast majority of tutors in further education. So I think things have certainly shifted a lot, whereby actually a lot of teachers, and actually, if I'm honest, when I reflect on my grammar school experience, which you might think to be different because further education is vocational and its students have done less well in the academic subjects, etc. Actually, in the grammar school experience, a high-end grammar school, very knowledge-focused, etc., these sorts of therapeutic aspects and the empathy for the students is really strong. And my daughters go to a really good grammar school. And the thing that drives me crazy about their education, they've had a brilliant education in many respects, is they say to me, Dad, all the time, they're 17 and 19 now, they say, don't judge me. Don't judge me. That's their big, big thing. And it's common across all of their peers as well. They're really smart, they know a lot of stuff, they can hold their own in an argument, but as soon as the argument is going somewhere where it involves a moral value judgment, they're all on edge. They can't cope with it. And that seems to me to be very much related to what you're talking about. And what a disaster to have a generation of people who cannot cope with judgment.
Great, very good. I think, yeah, and then can you pass that one to Alka?
Hi, I teach at university undergraduate students, and I'm a bit more optimistic. I teach a lot of teenagers. They have all sorts of problems, and some really serious. But there are two things happening. You know, Alex, you said we lost control. I don't quite agree with that. I mean, I have students coming to me saying, I can't do presentations, I will collapse, my mental health, whatever. And the well-being team will clearly say, Rose, can you change the assessment? Don't make them do a presentation, make them do something else. I say, no, I'm not going to. And they will accept that. So I think it's up to the individual teacher actually to stand up to all this, and it's possible to do. And the other hopeful message is actually from students. I mean, if students come to me with issues, I do have to refer them to our well-being team. You know, that's no question about it. Otherwise, you know, it would be. But anyway, the point I want to make is a lot of them have tried it before and they didn't like it. They don't want to go back to it. Or they say, you know what? No, I just needed to talk about it. Now it's out. I will deal with it. And we're talking serious issues here. I mean, you know, they're young adults who are still trying to find their way in life. So teachers and students are kicking back, I think.
Yeah, great, nice one. Alka, anyone else who wants to speak, put their hand up. Yeah, and then we'll come here.
I mean, I think the intrusion into schools of the whole panoply of therapeutic advisory people and outside agencies is just make things even more difficult for teachers already in a very difficult situation. Just a very quick practical example. I had spent about 30 minutes of a 50-minute lesson trying to get a very large 16-year-old spotty youth to open his book. And we went through all kinds of, I can't read, miss, will you come and sit next to me and we will read the book together. Eventually, he started to move. Yeah, he got his bag and was coming over to sit with me. And somebody opened the door, popped his head around the corner and said, "Hiya, Tom, how are you doing?" And he just threw his book in the air and says, "I can't do it, I'm too stressed, I can't do it, I'm too stressed." It was such an example of kind of Pavlov-trained behaviour by this know-nothing counsellor intruding on my lesson by your leave. I really felt like swearing at him. I mean, I didn't, but I really, really did. So that's kind of micro, everyday example of another further erosion of teacher authority. But what I wanted to ask was, I mean, it's very interesting, actually, because I think you've sort of pointed to, and what you and Dennis were saying, were pointing to another aspect on what I think is a fetishized discussion going on in the wider culture about the need to protect children from the culture's smartphones and things like that. Because, I mean, I feel clearly there is something a bit worrying about what children have access to on smartphones. But I just simply do not buy the idea that the solution to this is to ban smartphones tout court. Schools is another thing. I'd be more in favour of that. But to ban all phones for all under 16s, to me seems just entirely a kind of fetishising the problem, not addressing the real problem, because whatever it is that they are seeing, or, if they took away the phones, when the kid goes on the underground, they're going to see the posters. When they put on the telly, they're going to watch telly. When they go out in the streets, they're going to, So you can't sort of protect people from life like that. But I am very worried about this constant second guessing, because I do recognise that. And I think it's quite corrosive. And I think also when you combine that second guessing with something, again, going back to Arendt, about, when you take away adult authority, it's actually really, really cruel. What a cruel thing to do, to put the burden of the world's problems onto the shoulders of people who are not yet fully formed. I I never saw anything sicker than Greta Thunberg, actually, on the telly.
Great, thanks. There's this gentleman here.
Question for Alex and maybe Ashley as well. I'm an engineering scientist in energy, so I recognize what you say about climate change and the accounts given about climate change. And you kept on using the phrase, what could have happened, indicating a lack of trade-off. Yes, there's a problem here, but on the other hand, there might be some positives there. Fossil fuels, carbon, fossil fuels, civilization, etc. That would have been the way of the philosopher, of the engineer, of the scientist, on the one hand, on the other hand. And Ashley used the phrase, the science has revealed. And revelation is not the way of the philosopher, but of the theologian. So my question to you is that what is going on? That there is not a scientific problem that needs to be solved and studied, but a revelation that needs to be protected somehow? Is that what's going on?
Yeah. Nice, thanks. Anyone else want to get in on this round? Yeah, take it to the phone.
So when I was working on my second to last book, I was very interested to find out when the language of mental health began to be applied to identity-related issues. And I did a Google search and I did a couple of database searches. And I was really surprised to find out that the association of homework with mental health presentations came in very, very early on. And already in the pre-First World War period, there were new newspaper articles, and it's always in the United States. I mean, when you look back, everything bad that happens in education begins in the United States. It's an unerring, development, and there are good reasons as to why it happens in the United States. But the interesting thing is, there were in 1918, there were a whole series of articles being written about the dangers of homework, how homework deforms the child, how children become sort of, and they wrote these most grotesquely sort of scary stories about children who basically have started to become incontinent at the age of 16 because of homework, and how their skin turned into all kinds of crocodile scale kind of things. And it really was like a fantasy story from a Hollywood film. And this was going on at a time when therapeutic education did not yet exist. It really wasn't sort of institutionalized. And when I was looking at the discussion, it became very, very clear to me that the discussion on the mental health problems of homework was very much linked to the confusion and the anxiety that parents had towards how to bring their own kids up. So it was linked to the problem of parenting at the same time. And it was also linked to the fact that a lot of the teachers were having to deal with, for the first time, with the fact that, in contrast to the past, when the high school in America was still in the state of evolving, the high school, as we now know, didn't really exist until the early 20th century. a lot of teachers were having problems knowing what to do with large numbers of students coming, because everybody came into high school at a certain point, whereas in the past it was like a really small number of individuals. And so when I looked at this, I then began to rethink what the therapeutic education impulse is really all about. And I came to the conclusion that what was really happening was basically a situation where increasingly medicalization became used as an all-purpose explanation and an all-purpose excuse to avoid having to deal with the whole question of exercising your authority as a grown-up, of being able to control a classroom, of being able to motivate children. All these things that are difficult for the adult world gradually began to be reframed in a medicalized vocabulary. And in many respects, the kind of things that the panel is discussing 60, 70, 80 years later is really a more crystallized expression of trends that were already there, and which basically was to do with the avoiding of the taking of responsibility as to how you begin to crack this problem. And I think it's very interesting that now you get to the point where, a lot of adults almost have a sense of relief. And it is a sense of relief when they say, oh, my son's got dyslexia, right? Wow, that's really good to know. It wasn't shit teaching, and it wasn't the fact that my son is a little bit lazy in terms of applying himself. It's dyslexia. Oh, my daughter's got ADHD. This is really good news. It is setting. I mean, it's almost like there's a joy that, it wasn't a problem to do with parenting or teaching or adult authority. It's almost as if medicine and medicalization then becomes a medium through which the adult world is able to legitimate its avoidance of responsibility. And I think that kind of push, which begins in the domain of childhood at a certain point, gradually leads to a situation where, and this is, I think, the new frontier, where the child's mental health issues that they have then become recycled into the world of adults. So, you mentioned, I think it was you mentioned the word bullying or something, or somebody else. Well, bullying used to be something that children did to each other, whereas now bullying is what adults do to each other. I mean, it's almost imperceptibly, bullying has become an adult problem, whereas before it was a child problem. So this erosion of the boundary between child and adult is very important, because you have two things happening. You have the adultification of children, which means that they are internalizing psychological problems that only adults had in the past, like depression. The argument was in Freudian and other psychiatry that children never get depressed, only adults, but now they get depressed. And then you have the infantilization of adults, where they get bullied and have other childish kind of complaints become recycled into their world.
Great, thanks. And anyone else want to come in? We've got time for maybe a couple of questions, and then I'll get the responses from the panel. So a couple of thoughts, and then we'll close out with some thoughts from the panel.
I would like to thank Paige for the heads up. Not the book with Air Canada anytime soon. So my question follows from that. How does the business community react to the, let's say, education basically becoming totally without value? I mean, how can you feel safe taking a plane, crossing a bridge, or walking around in a large building in Canada when all this is one generation further?
Great, thanks. Was there someone at the back a hand up, or did I imagine it? I hope for it, maybe? No. Okay, well, let's get some closing statements out. I guess I'll just take you from this direction. So, Alex, some thoughts to reflect on. Obviously, there's a lot of things on the table, from the kind of role of adults in all of this through to the role of emotions. We've had a little bit of a debate about whether there's cause for optimism, who's pushing back. Is there anything kind of positive that we can end on, even if we do recognize we have a big problem on our hands? But, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are small signs of optimism, maybe, but it's a bit like the snowflake term that, while it describes some young people and adults. There are others who go the other way, aren't they? And so, in response to Ruth, yes, there are plenty of students. You tend to focus on the ones that are having difficulties, but the majority, I would say, don't use this language and get on with it and do very well. So maybe they're very resilient without resilience training. So that's the hopeful thing. The question about, is this a revelation in relation to sort of climate change and what's going on? I mean, I think the phrase, responsibility, as the Arendtian phrase of taking responsibility for the world, is apt here, and that I think for lots of people in society, climate change has become like an existential crisis. So maybe it's very difficult for teachers to stand up and say and defend maybe their society and say, this is our world, this is what we've built, and that's a good thing. It does feel like climate change is a problem that people think and they can't solve. Whereas if society had more resources, had more optimism about people and our capacity for dealing with obviously what is a significant problem, you would say to young people, okay, right, but yeah, there's this problem, but this is how we're going to deal with it. This is how we're going to deal with it. We're going to show them, you show them the way forwards. But clearly, adults, there aren't many adults who are doing that.
Yeah, no, important point. Paige, some final thoughts.
So in terms of the business community reaction, I mean, certainly something that you hear about, and I know this is just anecdotal, and it's actually something that we'd like to look into in our research, but the engineering programs, for example, when students are entering them from high school, so they're entering into the university level, they're having to reteach basic math and things that really students should know and should have learned in their primary and secondary schooling. And this is a big concern, certainly for the community, for that community in Canada, engineering and other fields. Alka, I want to talk to you more about smartphones in classrooms and in general, because I don't agree with you on that point. I think it's there's some research connecting smartphone distraction to a reduction or a decline in math achievement in students, but I do think that it kind of represents it. I'm a bit more concerned about it, I guess, than you are, which is a bit more doom and gloom, and you wanted optimism, so we can follow up on that later. But maybe just to tie it, I think you made a really wonderful point about Hannah Arendt, and that's what I sort of took away from the reading as well, or her thoughts on education and natality, and children are not adults, and they shouldn't be made to take responsibility for what is the responsibility of adults. And I think that really ties in well to some of the curricular changes that we've seen in Canada, like inquiry learning, discovery math, where students are made to, instead of being taught clearly, here are the foundational facts in math. Okay, then go on to solve the problems, then go on to critically think and do complex equations. We begin with, why don't you try to solve the problem for yourself? Think about what the answer might be. And the thing is, if you think about that logically, that's very stressful for a child. They're not equipped with the knowledge that they need in order to solve that problem. And that is probably one small-scale example that extends to a whole bunch of what we're talking about. So I think there's sort of an awakening. Certainly I can say that amongst parents in Canada, that this is a bit backwards. We're not doing things in the right direction. And so I think that's maybe the bit of optimism, is that sometimes these things go just too far and push parents in particular too far, where we might start to see a shift.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Dennis.
Oh, I don't need that. No, sorry. Tony's question about the state, I mean, the state is involved through lots of agencies. I mean, it is both spontaneous and state involved, but they fund and support everything to millions and millions of pounds. I think in Newcastle they were offering counselling to every single pupil, whether they had mental health problems or not, funded by the state. It's not always directly the state, it's usually through agencies, because that's how the state works. And it's very difficult, I used to say it's very difficult to say, we've got this idea, we'll see our population as pathetic, can't cope individuals. You can't put that into a policy statement. But I think it is crystallising around mental health. Everybody has mental health problems. But I've come back to teacher training, because it's not just teacher training colleges. I mean, just look at the books that teachers are reading. Endless things about therapy in the classroom. And I've been to some in-service training, and there's lots of it. People make a fortune for this. And I always remember one, which was... I just stayed behind after I'd given some talk somewhere else. There were 700 people in a room. And up comes this picture of the human brain. And part of it was pink, and part of it was blue. And this lecturer had been brought over from Australia, I can't remember who it was now, but at about £2,000 for this hour, said, we all know that when we feel happy, our reptilian brain reduces and our human brain expands. So 700 teachers, all sitting at circular tables, by the way, you know, the usual conference things, lapping this up. So but one thing you could do that's really positive is try and get into that area and do some decent training, because they believe it. You know, I've forgotten the technical name for that sort of theory. It's bullshit, I think.
Yeah, great.
Sorry, just...
No, actually, some final thoughts. I'm especially keen for someone, or maybe I'll have to, but pick up, because this point about it really representing a crisis of adult authority and adults' ability to exercise themselves. And I think, I mean, there's almost like a kind of middle class, maybe American stereotype of the like anxious parent who are overbearing of their children and discovering all of these kind of illnesses and conditions and the technical term, projecting their neuroses onto their children. But I think we have to grapple with the degree to which, there's teachers involved, and I'm sure some students or pupils kind of like seeing themselves in this way, but do we have a kind of broader problem here as well?
You know, what's funny about that is that we're so obsessed with mental health and the fragile mental health of children that Wales has outlawed giving a child a smack on the back of the legs. That is now assault. You've assaulted your child. But we have no problems with engaging in complex psychological manipulation to go get them to see their grandmother. That's how discipline works now. So I'm trying to explain, that's how authority works now, through these like convoluted structures. So it's, you know, Slavoj Žižek always gives this example where he's like, you know, the old disciplinarian father would say, you're going to your grandmother's whether you like it or not. The new one says, I know that you must know your grandmother loves you. But at the same time, I only want you to go see your grandmother if you truly want to. So now, not only do you have to go see your grandmother, you have to enjoy it. So it gets the whole way through. And that, I think, is a very insidious form of authority. But in terms of some of these questions, someone mentioned about loss of sleep being normal. And, you know, maybe that's normal around a test. I remember I took standardized testing when I was a kid. Do not remember it. I remember that the word, I had to put down my sex, and I remember giggling. Like it meant nothing to me, because no one around me told me it was supposed to stress me out. So it did not. I have a very vague recollection of these tests. But what we fail to realize, we are positively promoting anxiety as a positive attribute of the good citizen. You're supposed to be, like Greta Thunberg says, no, how dare you, like, enjoy things, you know? You're supposed to be anxious. And at the same time, that's a bad thing. So it becomes virtuous to be ill, becomes good to be ill. And what we're missing is that you don't need to teach people. So, well, instead of teaching them this, why don't we teach them resilience? Instead of teaching, no, that's why we teach them knowledge. That's why we teach them knowledge. You don't need to focus so much on your damn self all the time. You focus on something outside of yourself. I know it's a cliche, but Viktor Frankl's line, he who has a why can bear almost any how, is something that we should remember as teachers.
Great, thanks. We thank the panel.